My sister smiled at me from across my father's hospital bed the night he died. Not a sad smile. Not a grieving smile. The kind of smile that told me she already knew something I didn't. I didn't understand it then. I would spend the next 8 months wishing I had paid closer attention to that smile. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, because stories like this remind us that the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, always finds its way back to the surface. My name is Caroline Merritt. I was 43 years old when my father, Harold Merritt, passed away in a small hospital room in Asheville, North Carolina, on a Tuesday evening in late October. The leaves were turning outside his window, deep red and burnt orange, and I remember thinking that it was exactly the kind of evening my father would have loved. He always said autumn was the only honest season. Everything else was pretending. Dad was 78. He had lived a full life by most measures, but to me, losing him felt like losing the floor beneath my feet. He had been my anchor for as long as I could remember. My mother had passed when I was 11, and after that it had just been the three of us, Dad, me, and my older sister, Diane. Diane was 4 years older than me. She was polished in a way I never was, always put together, always composed, always saying the right thing at the right moment. Growing up, people used to assume she was the responsible one, the capable one, the one who had her life figured out. I was the quiet daughter, the one who preferred books over parties, who married young and simply, who never chased money or status. My husband, Ray, was a contractor. We had a modest house in Weaverville, about 20 minutes from where Dad lived. We had 2 teenagers, Marcus and Lily, and a life that was uncomplicated and full. I never wanted more than what I had. Diane had moved to Charlotte years ago. She married a man named Gregory who worked in real estate development, and together they lived in a large house in a gated community with a pool they used maybe 3 times a year. They had money. Not life-changing money, but enough to make them feel important. Enough to make Diane act like the gap between her life and mine was something she had earned rather than something she had simply stumbled into. For most of our adult lives, Diane and I had a relationship that I would describe as careful. We were polite. We called on birthdays. We showed up at the same holiday tables and made conversation and pretended that we were close. But the truth was, something had always been slightly off between us. A tension I could never quite name. A distance that never fully closed, no matter how many times we sat in the same room. I told myself it was just the way some siblings were. Different lives, different priorities. I never let myself believe it was something darker. Dad's health had been declining for about 2 years before he passed. His heart was failing slowly, not dramatically, not all at once, just a gradual dimming, the way an old lamp flickers before it goes dark. During those 2 years, it was me who drove him to his appointments. It was me who organized his medications, who talked to his doctors, who sat with him on his porch drinking coffee and listening to him tell stories about my mother. It was me who was there. Diane came down from Charlotte maybe 4 or 5 times during those 2 years. She always had reasons why she couldn't come more often. Gregory's work schedule. The kids' activities. A conference she couldn't miss. I didn't complain. I didn't make her feel guilty. Dad was my father too, and being present for him wasn't a burden. It was something I wanted to do. But I noticed. I filed away every visit that didn't happen, every phone call that was shorter than it should have been, every time Dad's eyes went a little quiet after he hung up with Diane. I noticed, and I stayed quiet, because I thought that was what a good person did. The night Dad died, Diane arrived at the hospital about 2 hours before the end. She swept in with Gregory trailing behind her, wearing a beautiful camel-colored coat, her hair perfect. She kissed Dad on the forehead and held his hand and said all the right things, and the nurses looked at her with soft eyes like she was a devoted daughter. Dad passed quietly just before 9 o'clock that evening. The room was still. A nurse came in to confirm the time, and I stood there with my hand still holding his, unable to speak, unable to move. That was when I looked up and saw Diane watching me from the corner of the room. And she was smiling. It wasn't cruel, exactly. It wasn't obvious. If you hadn't been looking carefully, you might have missed it entirely. But I had spent 43 years watching Diane's face, and I knew her expressions the way you know the cracks in a wall you've stared at for years. That smile wasn't grief. That smile was satisfaction. I told myself I was imagining it. I told Ray about it that night when we got home, and he rubbed my back and said that grief does strange things to the way we see people. I nodded. I went to bed. I tried to believe him. Dad's funeral was held the following Saturday. It was a small service. He had wanted it that way. A few old friends, some neighbors, our families. The pastor said kind words. We buried him next to my mother on a hill behind the church they'd attended together for 40 years. After the burial, Diane pulled me aside near the parking lot. The sky was flat and white, and the air smelled like cold earth. She was holding her coat closed with one hand, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. We need to talk about the estate, she said. Just like that. No preamble. No build-up. No softness. I remember thinking it was too soon. Dad had been in the ground for less than an hour. Can we give it a few days? I said. Diane's expression didn't change. There are some things you need to know, she said, and it's better that you hear them from me now. I should have felt the ground shifting beneath me in that moment. I should have recognized what was coming. But I was standing at my father's graveside, still raw and hollow from grief, and I was not prepared for what Diane said next. She told me that Dad had updated his will 6 months earlier. She told me that everything, the house, the land, the accounts, had been left to her. She told me that I was not in the will at all. The world went very quiet. I could hear the wind moving through the bare trees at the edge of the cemetery. I could hear the sound of car doors closing somewhere in the distance. I looked at my sister's face and I could not find anything there that looked like regret. I know this is hard to hear, she said, in the tone of someone who did not think it was hard at all. But Dad made his decision. I couldn't speak. I stood there holding my coat together against the cold and I felt something inside me begin to crack. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in the way of frozen lake cracks in late winter. Slowly, deeply, all the way down. I drove home that afternoon in silence. Ray kept glancing at me from the passenger seat, waiting for me to say something, and I couldn't find the words. Marcus and Lily were already home when we arrived, and I walked straight to the bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed until the light in the room changed from afternoon gray to evening dark. I kept coming back to one thought. One question that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. My father loved me. I knew that with the same certainty I knew my own name. He had told me so 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways, over the course of a lifetime. He had held my hand at my mother's funeral and told me to be brave. He had danced with me at my wedding with tears in his eyes. He had sat on his porch and told me I was the best part of his later years. So why had he cut me out of everything? And why had Diane been smiling? The weeks after the funeral moved slowly. Grief has a way of stretching time. Mornings felt endless, evenings collapsed without warning, and I found myself going through the motions of ordinary life while something inside me stayed completely still. Ray gave me space. He took over more at home, made dinners I barely tasted, kept the kids from asking too many questions. He was gentle in the way that he always was, careful with me the way you're careful with something that might break. I loved him for it, and I also couldn't bear it, because his gentleness reminded me of exactly how fragile I had become. Diane didn't call for 3 weeks. When she finally did, it was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Her voice on the phone was businesslike, professional. She told me she had met with Dad's attorney, a man named Walter Finch who had handled Dad's affairs for over 20 years, and that the estate was being processed. She said she wanted me to have a few personal items from the house, some photographs, a quilt my mother had made, a few of Dad's books. She said it the way you might tell someone they could take home the leftover food from a party, casually, as though she were doing me a favor. What about the house? I asked. My voice was steadier than I expected. I'm going to sell it, she said. There was a brief pause, and then, it doesn't make sense to hold on to it. Gregory thinks we could get a strong price for the land, especially with the market right now. Dad's land. 5 acres in the Asheville foothills, land he had tended and loved for 35 years. Land where I had grown up running barefoot through tall grass in the summers. Land where he had grown his tomatoes and kept his bird feeders and watched the mountains change color through the seasons. Diane, I said slowly, can I ask you something? Of course. When did Dad change his will? A pause. About 6 months before he passed. Why? Another pause, longer this time. He had his reasons, Caroline. I don't think it helps either of us to go back over it. He never said a word to me, I said. Not once. Not a single conversation, not a hint. Dad was private, Diane said. You know that. He wasn't private with me, I said, and my voice cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly, and I hated myself for letting it. Diane made a sound that was almost sympathetic. Almost. I know this is difficult, she said. But this was what he wanted. We have to respect that. She said goodbye. She hung up. I sat in the kitchen for a long time afterward, listening to the house settle around me. Something didn't fit. I had spent more time with my father in the last 2 years of his life than anyone else. I had been in his house every week, sometimes twice a week. I had sat with him through the long afternoons when he was too tired to do much more than watch the birds at the feeder and tell old stories. We had talked about everything, his memories, his regrets, my childhood, my mother. And at no point, not once, had he said anything that suggested he was rethinking how his estate would be divided. Not once had he seemed anything other than loving and present with me. I started going back through my memories of those last months like someone searching a room for something they were sure they had left there. Looking for a moment, a conversation, a shift in the way he looked at me. There was nothing. Every memory I had of him from that time was warm and close and real. I began to wonder what Diane had done. The thought arrived carefully, quietly, the way dangerous thoughts sometimes do. Not as an accusation. Just as a question, sitting at the back of my mind, refusing to leave. 2 weeks later, I drove out to Walter Finch's office in downtown Asheville. I had called ahead and explained who I was, and he had agreed to see me, though his voice on the phone had the careful neutrality of someone who had anticipated this conversation. Walter Finch was a trim, silver-haired man in his late 60s. He had a tidy office with framed diplomas on the wall and a view of the street below. He greeted me with genuine kindness. He had known our family for decades, and I could tell he found this situation uncomfortable. I sat across from him and asked him to walk me through the will. He did. Carefully and thoroughly. And everything Diane had told me was correct. The will that was on file had been updated 11 months before Dad's death. It left the entirety of the estate, including the house, the land, and 3 separate savings accounts, to Diane Patricia Merritt Holloway. My name appeared nowhere in the document. I looked at Walter Finch and I asked him the question that had been living inside me for weeks. Did my father seem himself when he signed this? Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at his desk. Then he looked back at me. Your father was elderly, Caroline, he said carefully, and his health had been declining. But was he coherent? Did he understand what he was signing? He was present at the signing, Walter said. He spoke clearly. He answered my questions correctly. Did you have any concerns? I asked. Walter Finch was a careful man. I could see him choosing his words the way someone chooses a path through a field, one step at a time, watching where they put their feet. I noted at the time that the change was significant, he said slowly. And I did ask your father if he was certain. He said that he was. Did he say why? Walter hesitated. He said that you had your own life and your own security. That he wasn't worried about you. I stared at him. That's it. Walter looked at me steadily. That's what he said. I drove home slowly that afternoon, my hands tight on the wheel. I turned Walter's words over and over. That I had my own life. That he wasn't worried about me. It was the kind of thing someone would say if they had been fed a particular story about my life. A comfortable story. A story that justified what was happening. And I already knew who would have told it. What I didn't know yet was how far Diane had been willing to go. What I didn't know yet was the full shape of the thing she had built. But something had shifted inside me that afternoon in Walter Finch's office. I was done being sad. I was starting to get very, very curious. I went home and told Ray what I was thinking. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and he listened carefully, the way he always did, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment. "You think she manipulated him?" he said. "Not a question. I think she told him something that wasn't true," I said. "And I think she timed it carefully." 6 months before he died, Ray said quietly. 6 months, I repeated. When he was at his weakest. When his heart was failing and his energy was low and he couldn't always think as clearly as he used to. I paused. When I wasn't there every single moment. Ray reached across the table and took my hand. "What do you want to do?" I looked at my husband. I thought about my father's porch, and the coffee, and the birds at the feeder. I thought about 35 years of Saturday mornings and holidays and quiet afternoons. I thought about a smile across a hospital room. "I want to know the truth," I said. "All of it. I want you to understand something about the months that followed, because it would be easy to look back at this story and make it sound clean and purposeful from the start. It wasn't. It was messy and painful, and there were days when I genuinely didn't know if I was chasing justice or simply refusing to accept grief. There were days when I wondered if I was the problem, if I was the bitter sister, the one who couldn't accept that her father had made a choice and move on. Ray talked me through those days. So did my closest friend, a woman named Paula, who had known me since we were both 22 and who had the particular gift of telling me hard truths without making me feel small. Paula was the one who first said it out loud. We were sitting in her kitchen in early December, about 6 weeks after Dad's funeral, and I had laid out everything I knew. The timeline. The will change. Diane's smile. Walter Finch's careful words. Paula listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she folded her hands on the table and said, "You need to talk to your father's neighbors." I looked at her. "If something was happening at that house during those months," she said, "someone saw it. People always do." I had thought about the neighbors, but something had stopped me from going there. A feeling that it was crossing a line, that it was making the private public, that it was the kind of thing people in my family simply didn't do. We kept things contained. We absorbed pain quietly. We managed. But Paula was right. And I was tired of managing. Dad's nearest neighbor was a woman named Ruth Caldwell, 71 years old, who had lived in the house next door for over 20 years. She and Dad had a friendship built on shared fence lines and vegetable gardens and an annual tradition of trading Christmas cookies. She had come to his funeral and wept quietly in the back pew, and I had hugged her and thanked her for coming. I called Ruth on a Thursday morning in early December and asked if I could stop by. She said yes without hesitation, and when I arrived she already had coffee waiting. Ruth Caldwell had the kind of face that had lived through things. Deep-set eyes, a steady gaze, the particular calm of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the world. She sat across from me at her kitchen table and listened as I explained, as simply and honestly as I could, what I was trying to understand. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your sister was here a lot more than 4 or 5 times." I felt the air leave the room. "How many times?" I asked. Ruth thought for a moment. Starting about 18 months before Harold passed, she was here nearly every month. Sometimes more. Always when you weren't around. I stared at her. "How do you know I wasn't around?" "Because your car is distinctive," Ruth said simply. "That green Subaru. Whenever I saw it in the driveway, I knew it was you. And whenever your sister came, your car was never there." She paused. "She always came during the week. You came weekends mostly, right?" I nodded slowly. "She'd stay 2, 3 days sometimes," Ruth said. "There was a man with her a few times. I assumed it was her husband." "Gregory," I said. "And once," Ruth paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, "once I saw a man I didn't recognize. Thin, dark suit. He came with your sister and they were inside for about 2 hours. I remember because Harold seemed upset after that. He came outside to tend his tomatoes and he had that look he'd get when something was bothering him. You know the one." I knew exactly the one. "I wanted to ask him about it," Ruth said, "but it wasn't my place. You know how Harold was, private, but not in a cold way. He just didn't like to burden people." "No. He just didn't like to burden people. He would have absorbed whatever Diane had brought into that house and sorted through it alone. Quietly, the way he sorted through everything. I thanked Ruth. I drove home with my hands shaking slightly on the wheel, not from fear but from the strange particular feeling of watching something you suspected become real. A man in a dark suit. Inside Dad's house for 2 hours. An attorney. Not Walter Finch. I spent the next 3 days making calls. I contacted Walter Finch's office again and asked whether Dad had seen any other attorneys in the 18 months before his death. Walter said he had no way of knowing that, but that the will update had been processed through his office and the document had come to him already drafted, with a request to formally log it. I asked him who had delivered the document. Another careful pause. It came through a courier, he said, with a cover letter from a firm in Charlotte. He gave me the name. Langley and Croft, Family Law. Charlotte. Gregory's City. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and spent 2 hours going through everything I could find about Langley and Croft. They were a mid-sized firm that handled estate planning, trusts, and family law for high-net-worth clients. Gregory Holloway, Diane's husband, appeared in a LinkedIn connection to one of the partners. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen. If I was right, and I was beginning to feel very strongly that I was, Diane had spent 18 months carefully and deliberately isolating our father from the truth of my life, constructing a version of reality that made me appear either undeserving or already provided for, and then arranging for an out-of-town law firm with no existing relationship to our father to draft a new will and send it to Walter Finch as a completed document for processing. And she had done it during the months when Dad's health was failing and his judgment was softening and he was too tired and too sick to question the story he was being told. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I need you to understand what it felt like to realize it. Not just that my sister had taken my inheritance, but that she had spent 1.5 years patiently and methodically building a lie. That she had sat across from my dying father and fed him false information about his own daughter. That she had shaped his final perception of me. And then she had smiled at me across his hospital bed. If you've ever had someone in your life do something that fundamentally changed who you understood them to be, you know what the next few days felt like. There's a grief inside the grief. Not just what was lost, but what you thought was real that wasn't. I cried more in those 3 days than I had since the funeral. Ray held me through the worst of it. Paula sat on the phone with me for 2 hours one night while I just talked. Let it out. Tried to put words to something that kept expanding past the words I had for it. And then, somewhere around the 4th morning, I got up and made coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the bare winter yard, and I felt something settle inside me. I wasn't done crying, but I was done being still. I picked up the phone and called a lawyer. If you're still here with me, if this story is landing somewhere real for you, I just want you to know you're not alone in whatever you've faced. Leave a comment below and tell me if you've ever had someone you trusted rewrite your story behind your back. You'd be amazed how many people have been right where I was. The attorney I hired was a woman named Sandra Bryce. She worked out of a small but respected firm in Asheville, and she had a reputation specifically in estate disputes and will contests. Paula had found her through a friend, and when I walked into Sandra's office on a Tuesday morning in January and told her everything, she listened without once looking skeptical. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. What you're describing, she said carefully, is undue influence. It's one of the more difficult things to prove in an estate case, but it's not impossible. Especially if the circumstances are as specific as you're suggesting. What would I need? I asked. Evidence of a pattern, she said. Not just one conversation, not just one visit. A sustained effort to alter your father's understanding of reality in a way that benefited your sister at your expense. Medical records showing his cognitive state during the period the will was changed. Witnesses. Financial documentation if any money moved around in unusual ways. And ideally, some evidence of the communication between your sister and the firm that drafted the will. She paused. How are you with detail? I kept a lot of records, I said. Caregiver logs, appointment notes, medication schedules. I kept them partly for the doctors and partly just because I'm organized. Sandra almost smiled. That, she said, is going to matter. Over the next 6 weeks, Sandra and I built a picture. It was painstaking, careful work, The kind that doesn't look dramatic from the outside but that has a particular momentum once it starts moving. Every piece connected to another piece. Every piece made the next one easier to find. The medical records were the foundation. Dad's primary care physician, Dr. Ellison, had documented his decline carefully. In the months around the will change, about 6 months before Dad's death, he had noted increasing episodes of confusion, fatigue, and what he described as susceptibility to emotional influence. Not dementia, not a complete loss of judgment, but a significant enough softening of cognition that a skilled and motivated person could, in the right circumstances, shape his thinking. Ruth Caldwell agreed to provide a written statement documenting her observations of Diane's visits, their frequency, the time she had seen Dad seem distressed after Diane had been there, the man in the dark suit. 2 of Dad's other neighbors provided shorter statements corroborating Ruth's account of the unusual frequency of visits. And then there were the phone records. Sandra's investigator pulled what was available through legal channels, and what came back was striking. In the 14 months before the will was changed, Diane had called Dad's house, his landline, which he still had and used, an average of 9 to 12 times per month. Before that period, the record showed maybe 2 or 3 calls a month. The increase was abrupt. It started almost to the week after Diane had visited at a time when Dad had received a particularly difficult prognosis about his heart. She had known. She had seen the opening and she had moved into it. The financial records were the final piece, and they were the piece that made Sandra's expression change from careful to sharp. Dad's primary savings account, a joint account he had shared with my mother and then maintained alone for decades, had seen a series of transfers in the 8 months before he died. Each transfer was within the federal reporting threshold. Each one went to a different account number. Together, they totaled just over $4,000 to $7,000. The account numbers, when traced, led to a single entity, a family trust established in Charlotte, North Carolina, 2 years earlier, under the name of Gregory Allen Holloway. She hadn't just cut me out of the will. She had started moving the money before Dad even died. I remember sitting in Sandra's office when she showed me this and feeling something that I can only describe as a strange calm. Like when you've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and you finally put it down. Not relief, exactly, but a kind of clarity. The whole shape of the thing was visible now, and as terrible as it was to see it fully, there was something almost clarifying about it. I hadn't been crazy. I hadn't been paranoid. I hadn't been the bitter sister who couldn't accept reality. I had been right. Sandra filed the will contest in Buncombe County Probate Court in late February. The basis of the claim was undue influence, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and fraud in the inducement of a will change. It named Diane Patricia Merritt Holloway and, by extension, Gregory Holloway as respondents. Diane received the filing 3 days later. She called me that afternoon, and I let it go to voicemail. Her message was controlled at first, calm, measured, telling me that this was a mistake, that I didn't understand what I was doing, that I was going to destroy our relationship over something that was Dad's own decision. But by the end of the message, underneath the control, I could hear something else. Something tight and a little bit frantic. She called twice more that week. I didn't answer. In early March, I went to my father's house for what would be the last time before Diane listed it. She had changed the locks, I'd expected that. But I stood at the gate for a while and looked at the property. The winter garden was brown and bare, the bird feeders empty, the porch chairs still set the way he had left them. I stood there until the cold drove me back to the car. On the way home, I stopped at the little cemetery on the hill. I stood at my father's grave for a long time. The ground was still cold, but there was a faint smell of thawed earth underneath, the first hint that spring was coming. I told him what I had found. I don't know if I believe the dead can hear us. But I believe in the ritual of saying things out loud, in giving words to things that have only lived inside you. I told him I understood now. I told him I wasn't angry at him. I told him I was going to make it right. Not for the money, not for the land, but for him. Because no one should be manipulated in their final months. No one should be fed lies when they are too weak and too tired to sort the truth from the story they've been given. I drove home and I was ready. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in May. The courtroom was small and fluorescent lit. The kind of room that reminded you that justice is mostly procedural rather than dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no sudden confessions. What there was, in the end, was evidence. And there was a lot of it. Sandra presented the case with the methodical precision of someone who had done this work for 25 years. She walked the court through the timeline, the gradual increase in contact, the documented visits, the visits that had coincided with periods of particular vulnerability in my father's health, the out-of-town attorney, the will that had arrived drafted and complete rather than originating through the family's own long-standing legal counsel. She presented Dr. Ellison's medical documentation of Dad's cognitive state. She presented Ruth Caldwell's statement. She presented the phone records. And then she presented the financial records. The $47,000. The transfers below the reporting threshold, spread across 8 months, moving systematically into Gregory Holloway's family trust. Diane and Gregory were seated at the respondent's table with their own attorney, a man from the same Charlotte firm that had drafted the will. His name was Harlan Pierce, and he was polished and confident in the way that expensive attorneys often are. He spent the first part of the morning suggesting that Caroline Merritt was a disgruntled heir fabricating a narrative of betrayal because she had been excluded from a will by her own father's deliberate choice. But the evidence is a patient thing. It doesn't respond to tone. It doesn't back down when someone implies it's motivated by bitterness. It just sits there, document by document, statement by statement, and it tells the truth. When Sandra laid out the financial transfers and their destination, I watched Harlan Pierce's posture change. Just slightly. Just a careful repositioning of the shoulders. A practiced attorney's micro-adjustment, the kind that means they are recalibrating. Diane kept her face steady throughout the morning. She was dressed beautifully, as she always was. Her hair was perfect. She sat with the composed stillness of someone who had always relied on the appearance of calm to carry her through difficult moments. Beside her, Gregory was less composed. I could see his jaw working, the slight tension around his eyes. The hearing broke for lunch and Sandra told me we were in a strong position. The financial transfers are the most significant piece, she said. That moves this from a conversation about undue influence into actual financial exploitation. That changes the nature of what the court is looking at. In the afternoon session, Diane's attorney attempted to explain the transfers. He called Gregory to the stand to describe the family trust and suggest the money had been voluntarily gifted. Gregory spoke in measured, careful sentences, explaining that Harold had wanted to provide for his grandchildren's education, that the trust had been created for that purpose, that all of it had been entirely Harold's idea. Sandra let him finish. Then she stood up and asked Gregory one question. Mr. Holloway, can you produce a single document, a single email, a single letter, or any written record showing that Harold Merritt communicated this intention, in his own words, at any point before or after these transfers? Gregory opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his attorney. His attorney said something quietly and Gregory looked back at Sandra. We may need to request time to locate those records, Gregory said. I imagine you would, Sandra said quietly, and sat down. I looked at Diane at that moment. She had turned slightly in her chair, just a few degrees, just enough, and she was looking at Gregory with an expression I had never seen on her face in 43 years of knowing her. It was the expression of someone watching a plan come apart. Someone watching the thing they built with careful patience begin to fall. The court didn't rule that day. The judge took 3 weeks to issue a decision, and those 3 weeks moved the way I imagine water moves under ice, slowly and continuously and invisible from the surface. The ruling came on a Monday morning. Sandra called me as I was dropping Lily off at school. I sat in the parking lot, engine running, listening. The court found in my favor on both the undue influence claim and the financial exploitation claim. The will was set aside. The estate was to be divided equally between both daughters, as the previous will, the one made 12 years earlier, had specified. The financial transfers were to be investigated by the State Attorney General's office. Gregory's trust was to be frozen pending that investigation. I sat in the parking lot for a long time after Sandra hung up. I thought about calling Diane. I thought about a lot of things. In the end, I drove to Paula's house and sat in her kitchen and we drank coffee together and I let myself feel the whole complicated thing. The relief, the grief, the anger, the sadness, all of it together, without trying to flatten any one of them down. Because here is the thing that I want to be honest about. Winning that case did not give me back what I had really lost. The money mattered. I'm not going to pretend it didn't, because it was my father's life's work and it belonged to both of us. The house mattered. The land mattered. Having the truth on the record mattered. But what I had really wanted, somewhere underneath all of it, was an explanation. I wanted to understand how my sister, someone I had grown up with, someone who had stood at the same childhood table and eaten the same holiday meals and cried at the same graveside, had made herself into someone who could do this. Who could sit with a dying man and fill his head with lies. Who could smile across his hospital bed. I never got that explanation. Diane did not call me after the ruling. She did not write. For all I know, she and Gregory sat in their Charlotte house with its pool and their expensive attorneys and found a way to make themselves the victims of this story. People do that. They find the version of events that lets them keep their own self-image intact. I didn't contact her either. I don't know if I ever will. Some relationships are not repairable, and I think the hardest form of acceptance is accepting that the loss of a sibling is real and painful even when that sibling has done something unforgivable. There is no clean version of that grief. There is no resolution that takes the ache away. What I have instead is my father's house, sold and the proceeds properly divided, with my half set aside for Marcus's and Lily's college. What I have is 5 acres of land in the Asheville foothills that I couldn't bring myself to sell, so I didn't. I've been going up there on Saturday mornings, the way I always did, and I've been slowly bringing it back. Clearing the winter garden. Refilling the bird feeders. Sitting on the porch with coffee, listening to the mountains. It's not the same as having him there. Nothing will ever be the same as that. But it's mine. Legally. Finally. The way it was always supposed to be. And I've learned something from all of this that I want to leave you with. Because I don't think it's only my story. I think it belongs to a lot of people. I learned that paying attention matters. Not obsessive, suspicious attention, just presence. Just noticing. If something feels wrong in the way someone looks at you, if a smile lands in the wrong place, if a timeline doesn't quite fit, let yourself notice. You are not imagining it. I learned that quiet endurance has a limit, and that limit is worth knowing. Absorbing pain silently isn't always virtue. Sometimes it's just delay. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up and say, I know what I saw. I know what I know. And I am going to find out the truth. And I learned, maybe most of all, that truth doesn't always arrive dramatically. It arrives in documents and phone records and the steadfast memory of a neighbor who saw more than she let on. It arrives in medical notes and financial traces and one very careful question asked in a courtroom. It arrives. That's the thing. No matter how well someone builds their lie, no matter how long it holds, the truth arrives. By the way, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments, because it's genuinely amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. And if this one meant something to you, if it hit somewhere close to home, give it a like and subscribe to the channel, because every week we bring you stories that remind you that truth finds a way, and justice, even when it's slow, is real.